welcome to another live stream of the History Five podcast. And today I'm joined by John White. John White has a YouTube channel called Craig and Ford. It is tagged in the description below, and it will also be in the pinned comment. So if you are not already subscribed to his channel, you can click on that tag and you can subscribe to his channel now. With that being said, John, thank you for joining me today.
Hello, Jacob. A pleasure to speak again.
Yeah, it's good to have you back on, and we're going to be talking about the origin of the Proto-Indo-European religion, more specifically in terms of its relationship to Dyeus or Dyu, the Sky Father, and the connections with the Sky Father in different European cultures. And the other thing I want to ask you about is when we talked about this before, but I want to expand a little bit more on this. When you look at Manu or Mani, the Norse deity, and specifically how you see this god as being like the progenitor of myths, if you will. That's kind of been broken up. Like Odin, you see connections with Odin and that deity. But it was kind of like broken up a bit into maybe a couple of gods. But we'll sort all those details out.
Oh, well, then, yes, absolutely. Lots to talk about. It's a big subject. So we can certainly talk about that. So where would you like to begin?
So first, I would like to ask you about the earliest attestation of Dyu or Dyeus, the Sky Father. What do we know about him? The earliest iterations of that deity.
In terms of literature, the earliest attestation of that name would be in the Rig Veda, and the Rig Veda is probably around 3,500 years old, give or take a few years. And the god there is known as Dyeus, just Dyeus. But if you talk to someone who is familiar with Indo-European culture and their pantheon, they'd consider Dyeus to be Dyeus Putter, which most people translate as Sky Father. But it's probably more accurate to call it the Shining Father. So it makes you feel like it's daylight, a father of daylight, the day sky. And it's quite interesting that in the Rig Veda, Dyeus Putter becomes a Dyeus, because if we then look at other cultures in the Indo-European landscape, let's say Greek, we see Dyeus Putter potentially becoming Zeus. So Zeus is cognate with Dyeus, not Dyeus Putter. We see Jupiter, so that is more Dyeus Putter. And in Germanic, we have Tyr, which is cognate with Dyeus. So it looks as though Dyeus Putter, the Sky Father, seems to be just known by the name God, in effect. So Dyeus, we believe, is then sort of transformed into the meaning God. And so we have this general name for him used rather than the Sky Father. And what we find then in many pantheons is that the storm god eventually takes over, which is sort of the Indras and the Thors and alike, or the Sky Father takes on the role of the storm god, such as in Zeus and Jupiter. So that is where we see this deity coming in. So Rig Veda first, but you see Zeus mentioned in Homer's epics. We see then, so you've got Jupiter after that, but then there 800 BCE, we believe Homer's, like the Iliad and the Odyssey, were written. So 2.5 to 3,000 years old. So we do believe that it's unlikely that the Rig Veda and the religion from the Vedic culture had influenced Greece enough at the time to take Dyeus there. So we do believe it's a central Proto-Indo-European or Indo-European migration that has taken that language to those respective regions. However, that doesn't necessarily mean the exact functions of the god is the same, because that can change over time and distance travelled. But they, at the end of the day, Dyeus does seem to mean the chief god of the pantheon. But it seems to have lost the relationship with daylight or the sky.
Now I want to come back to what I was talking about in the beginning real quick. Let me try to rephrase what I said. What I meant to say is the Norse deity Ymir is the one
Okay.
that's connected more so with the
Yes.
Manu character from Hinduism. So I kind of put it in the wrong way. Specifically with Yama, who's the father of Manu. That's what I meant to say.
Okay.
Now, there are also connections that's made there with Odin that I'd like you to get into.
Absolutely.
And what the hypothesis is about the original form of that god. And also the connection with Tuisto.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, okay, we see a number of creation stories around that attested to in the Indo-European landscape. In Rome, we see a story of Romulus and Remus. We see in the Rig Veda the Purusa hymn, but we see the myth of creation in the. It's mentioned a bit in the Volaspor, which is a poem in the Poetic Edda, but we also see within the first, I think it's the first book of the Prose Edda as well, stories about this, so in Scandinavia. And we see hints of it from Tacitus, where we see Tusco, as you mentioned, and as hints in the Avestas from Iran and in Zoroastrianism. So by seeing these creation myths, it has allowed us to look at them and analyze the specific parts of them, and to see that they all have a common factor, which makes us believe that there is some evidence to suggest that these have all come from a single creation myth. And by doing that, we can construct that creation myth. And we believe that the core characters of that myth are Manu and Ymir, and meaning man and his twin or double or the number two. So Manu could be considered the first man and Ymir the second man. Now, what the creation myth itself goes that Manu sacrifices Ymir, so man sacrifices his twin, and from the twin's body he creates the world. So the flesh of Ymir becomes the soil, the bones become stone, the hair becomes grass, the eyes become the moon and the sun, and there's all these homologies, we would call them, linking the creation of the cosmos from this primordial body. So Manu and Ymir are primordial beings rather than deities per se. Now, or they are at this point primordial beings. And so you have this creation of the cosmos from the body. But then what we also see is a view where that people are then created from the cosmos. So if someone is born, they take flesh, or take soil to be the flesh, and rocks to be bones, and grass to be hair, and all these kind of things. And so you have this cycle of the cosmos, which is really important. And then you also get, as an aspect of this, this tripartite aspect, which Doomsday was quite famous for, which is that the head of the primordial body of Ymir is used to make the kings and priests of society. The torso is used to make the sort of warriors of society, and the legs are used to make the producers or the farmers of society. And so you have this sort of structure. And in fact, actually, more specifically, the kings are not just made from the head, they're also made from the torso and the legs. So they actually contain parts of all the other people. It's within them, so they should be able to understand everybody. And because people are made up from the body of Yimo, which was also used to make the land, the earth we live in, and the king is made up from all parts of the body, then the king and the land are joined. And this is a motif we see in Indo-European belief across a number of cultures. But what happens to Manu and Yimo? So Manu, after this event happens and creates the world, he comes down to the world and becomes the head priest, and he teaches people how to sacrifice in order to keep the world in order. And by that suggests that he is teaching people that, in effect, how to take bodies and put them back into the cosmos. So to take the head and the skull and the bones to make rocks and soil, and the blood for water. And that is the process of sacrifice. So we don't often talk about that. We say people, or things have been sacrificed by our ancestors, but actually the sacrifice was part of a ritual to reenact the creation myth of the cosmos. And we find that in many things going on. Much of it was ritualized, and much of it told a story that was already a key part of society. So the sacrifice of Yimo is replicated in the sacrifice of a being, which by chance actually almost sort of reflected in how you may actually serve dinner. If you have a large family dinner on a Sunday or Thanksgiving, there's much to be said that there's some analogies there on a sacrifice. So that's there. But what happens to Yimo? You think he's chopped up and he's now part of the world, and his body being used to create people. Well, he becomes the king of death. He becomes the lord of the underworld, because we didn't have heaven back in those days. People went to the underworld, or the other world, which is where the dead bodies went, and that is where Yimo went. And so we find much of this seen in, I say, these cultures from the Vedic culture, where we have the Purusa hymn of the Rig Veda, which I think is 9:10, I think, as a hymn, which it sort of slightly reflects where you have Yama involved, and Manu isn't directly involved in that part of creation, but Manu does exist in the Rig Vedas. We see it in Roman myths, say with Romulus and Remus, where Remus dies when he jumps over the wall of a city that Romulus has founded. In effect, it's like a reflex of that myth, rather than Romulus sacrificing Yimo, or Romulus sacrificing Remus to create the world. Romulus has created the city, and Remus is sacrificed. But that whole story is quite old, and it's changed significantly because of the amount of influence Indo-Europeans did and didn't have into Rome. But when we go to the Old Norse, we do see a clear analogy where we see Ymir is sacrificed to create the world in this same homology kind of way, with his skull being the firmament, and his brain the clouds, and his hair the grass, and his blood the sea. So we see all this going on. But Ymir is sort of etymologically connected to Yimo, because Ymir means two or twin, but there is no Manu, and I'll come back to that in a minute. And then we have what Twisco, as Jacob mentioned, as you mentioned, which is that Twisco is mentioned by Tacitus, which is around 2,000 years ago, where for Germania, where the Scandinavian stories are probably about 700 or 800 years old. So Tacitus was writing twice as long ago as the Eddas, but he mentions Twisco and some analogies there that could be linked to the tripartite system and the sacrifice. But there isn't enough there to actually allow us to recreate the Germanic version of the myth, just that there seem to be key characters there, talked about Manus and this Twisco. So it suggests that there is some sort of cultural transmission going on there, because we wouldn't necessarily, well, you could argue you could see the same story in different cultures that are closely related, speaking related languages, but you could also argue, well, perhaps they just came up by coincidence, which is possible but less likely, I feel. But when you actually realise that actually the names of the characters in these stories, Manu and Jimo, Man and his twin, and you see it in Manu and Yamo and Yimo, and we see it in the Ymir and in Tusco and Manus. It seems really likely that this is an Indo-European story that has transmitted. But why do we have the difference in the Scandinavian story? Why do we have Ymir being sacrificed not by Manu, but by Odin and his two brothers? So what we see here is that Odin, Vili, and Ve are taking part in the killing of Ymir, who is a bit more monstrous than he is normally perceived in other myths. And the view is that there has been some rewriting of mythology there, and that Manu probably was originally the person who sacrifices Ymir in the Scandinavian stories, in the Eddas, or the mythology that leads to the Eddas. But now, because of a change in the pantheons of Scandinavia, with the introduction of Odin, who's a relatively new god. So Odin in Scandinavia has probably only been around 2,000 years, give or take. Odin's come in as this chief god. He's also come in as a god of poetry, so he seems to have taken some of the powers and function of a god called Othur in Scandinavia, which is probably, because they sound similar, it may have been easier to join them. So Odin not only becomes a warrior god, but a god of poetry. And if you're a god of poetry, it means you're wise and clever, because knowing in all tradition poetry means you can recite all the stories, and so you must know many things. And because Odin has this capacity as having this knowledge, and therefore could be considered a priestly figure, it feels like he has been best placed to replace Manu in this mythology, in this cosmogony story. And so that is why we have Odin and his brothers sacrificing Ymir rather than Manu. So I think that is a good synopsis of all the sort of flavours we've got of the creation cosmogony of the Indo-Europeans. We see it across the landscape. The names are pretty consistent, which gives us confidence that it is the same story that has transmitted. But there are changes in mythology all around. We see, there's slight changes in the Rig Veda. Zoroastrianism comes along and changes everything on its head. It becomes far more spiritual. And Yimo turns into Geomart, who's a key figure in the Zoroastrianism creation. And Geomart is basically Geomarten, and Geo, it comes from Gemo or Gemi, which is cognate with Yimo. So we do believe that Yimo has been transferred to that. And there are hints in the Avestas of the old Indo-European cosmogony and religion, even though much else has changed. As I say, we've got Twisco, meaning two, in the Tacitus writing on Germania, and we got Ymir in the Scandinavian. So we have much confidence that we're comfortable that these primordial beings come from the same myth, which has dispersed. But what's even more interesting, I think, for me, is the homologies, the link in that the blood is the water, the flesh is the soil, and the like, because we actually see that in other texts as well. We see that in the Great Abundanism. We see that going up into the old Russian version of the Dove King, which we believe is influenced in Enoch. So it's also in Enoch. You see this homology of, I think it is the creation of Jesus is taken from those parts of the earth and turned into flesh. I think, or it might be the other way around. Maybe Jesus, when he died, turned into parts of the cosmos. But we see that there. So it definitely looks like those influences in the Dove King, which influenced Enoch, seem to have come possibly from an Indo-European belief that has transmitted itself some way into the Near East. Obviously, it didn't make its way into the Bible because Enoch wasn't included, but it's still interesting to see it going on in the Orthodox Church with the Dove King, which, although I think the texts we got are maybe 200 or 300 years old, we believe they have been originally influenced from Enoch 2,000 years ago. So we also see very similar styles of story in the Pangu, mythic Pangu in China. Where else would we see it? I think that's probably it for now. So that's much what we see, although we do see the killing of a primordial being to create the earth in the Enuma Elish, where you had Marduk killing Tiamat and splitting her in two to create the firmament and the land, and then obviously that flows into Genesis 1 and 1 2. So they are related. It's quite interesting to see that actually this whole landscape of Central and Western Asia and into Europe all sharing the same or having roots, it feels like, in the same cosmogonic background. So hopefully that's a summary for you, Jacob. I haven't whittled on too long.
Do you see connections between with Manu? Do you see connections between the two? Is the Sky Father in any way taking over attributes of that character?
Okay, so no, so Manu is a primordial being. The Sky Father Dyeus is a god, a chief god. So no, they aren't the same function or person, but I would believe, even if we haven't got or we haven't found attestations of the like, I feel there may be some connection there in terms of the most supreme mortal in the culture would want to talk to the first primordial being, so that, and the priest. So there may be some connection there story-wise, but there certainly isn't anything that's obvious that we can find and pull out and say this is the story. I mean, the closest you could argue is maybe with Odin, because he's replaced Manu. So Odin is a chief god and kills Ymir, but he's taken over the functionality of Manu, and Odin isn't actually a sky father. He's come from my personal belief is he's come from what we call the Wothu, which is a Germanic term for an old Proto-Indo-European name for a frenzied group of spirits. So imagine being in a forest at night and hearing a storm and the whistling winds going through and the trees rustling. That noise, and ancestors thought it was the gods, thought it was spirits making that noise, and they gave that this name of Wothu. And from Anatoly Lieberman's work in Prayer and Laughter, he puts a very good argument that evolved into Woden, and Woden went into Scandinavia, became Odin. And if you've got this sort of supreme, frenzied god who knows poetry, why he replaced Manu, I don't know, but it absolutely makes sense that he does, considering that, well, it's in the mythology. And there's no other probabilistic solution to that dilemma of why is Odin killing Ymir. The only way is that either Odin was there all the time, which he definitely wasn't. So it must be that Odin has replaced Manu, and we see that. We see these things happen all the time. We see it in the Greek pantheon is a clear sign of an agrarian pantheon having Indo-European influence on it over time. So we see that the Sky Father in the Greek pantheon, so we rather have Zeus linked to Dyeus, the actual Sky Father is Uranus. who's above that, a primordial being. We see Demeter, who's the Earth Mother, actually I think she probably is she a daughter of Zeus, or certainly a
Are you,
niece.
you're referring to Demeter, right?
Demeter, yes.
No, she's not Zeus's daughter.
No,
She's
she's or
at
niece or something.
times there are times that she's actually a consort, and I believe she's Persephone's mother by Zeus.
Yeah. Okay. So there's still some link there. There's different aspects because the Greek pantheon is evolving. So what I'm saying is we actually see mythologies changing with time, with influence from the Indo-Europeans coming in, especially along the southern or the northern Mediterranean. That is clear because that had a clear trading relationship with the Near East, and so there was obviously much to and fro of different cultures, and that really influenced that part of the world to be more, let's say, farming influence and agrarian influence rather than Indo-European influence. Even though it was there, it was lesser so, but we do see footprints of the Indo-Europeans in those myths. But that's why the Greek creation myth isn't a myth of Manu and Nemo. It's still the Near Eastern myth we find in the city of Danu and the Enuma Elish and the Hittite myth and the like.
So I want to bring this up real quick in regards to Odin, because it's noted that there was an older Norse Germanic deity called Tiwaz, and Tiwaz is
Tiwaz, yes,
often linked to Dyeus, and so it is thought that that Odin superseded and replaced that the older version of the Germanic Skyfather as being the Skyfather, basically.
As being Dyeus, yes.
Yeah.
He wouldn't necessarily just the Skyfather, but at this point, let's say these gods are just
right. I meant to say is replaced as a chief deity. I meant to say that's
replace absolutely. Yeah, Odin replaces chief deity because he's got this strength amongst him, because he's this frenzied spirit, because he's got poetry, means he's more resourceful. And so what you find is that you have Tiwaz, which goes to Tyr, and Tyr is a sort of like a god of justice, certainly a god of battle of some kind, because we find that there are certain spells or rituals that take place that allow Tyr's rune to be applied to weapons. So we see him quite strongly linked to battles. But this is at a time when the Roman Empire was trying to expand. There was fighting in Germania, and it may be that the people of that region felt that Tyr wasn't doing what was necessary, and they needed a new god. So they needed to replace him. Perhaps that's when the story of Tyr losing his arm to Fenrir came up. That we can't tell for sure. I mean, there's a lot of supposition there and guesswork, but without doubt, Tyr and Tiwaz, or so we see Tiwaz go to Tyr, which is cognated with Dyeus, and we see Odin replace. Tyr doesn't disappear, but Tyr is sort of relegated to a lesser important role within the pantheon, which is having his arm bitten off by Fenrir, the wolf, who is actually named after Loki.
And it seems like that, like a later version of Tiwaz or Tyr, as he's also called, would basically he would become like more of a war god. And he would be more, and that's why many seem to look at him as being similar to Ares or Mars, when originally he was less like that. He was more like the Sky Father in the character's original earliest
you mean
attested form. Yeah.
It's hard in Germania. It's hard to say because you don't have that data. but because there's a cognate Dyeus there, we make an assumption that Dyeus must come from Dyeus Pitta. But as I say, the father part is dropped, and we have to ask ourselves why. And there seems to be some relationship with how storm gods develop, because some of the Deuses take on a storm god role, and some of them don't. And then where they don't, the storm god sometimes takes over the pantheon, and we lose it. So it's complicated, Jacob, I think, is what I'm trying to say.
Right.
It's complicated, and we don't know for sure. We can guess, which is not very academic. But if I had to guess, it would be that it's Tiwaz who was there, was probably a chief god, very much fighting focused, which makes sense. Because that's mentioned, I think in Tacitus might mention Tiwaz actually, because they're battling the Germanic people are battling the Romans, to keep hold of their lands, and say maybe that he wasn't cutting it, or something happened. But what it is, it's hard to tell. It may be that there was a different set of Indo-European influenced people that came into Scandinavia, maybe from the north, because we do see some influence there with all the in the Iron Age, because there was lots of a particular iron ore in Scandinavia that I think that was quite good for sword making, if I remember right. There's a book by called 12,000 Years of Scandinavian History, by my friend Sturla, who talks about this migration of ore, and that may brought about a different migration of Indo-European influenced people down into Scandinavia, where before most of it was coming up from Germany through Denmark. So they may have brought this new view of the world and got rid of Tyr. And we also know there's other gods that may have been chief gods in that region, like Ulla, where we see lots of attestation to that in place names, which suggests that it's a very important god, but no trace of who Allah is at all, whether it's a man or a woman role in the pantheon. So it really is down to guesswork. To say anyone knows for sure would be wrong.
So when you look at the Sky Father in other European cultures, like for instance, like even including the in the Slavonic religion, Albanian religion, or various other religions within Europe, they have these, and they have Dyeus, or they have a sound that sounds a little like Dyeus, but it's
Yeah.
not quite. It kind of varies. Sometimes it sounds a little bit more different than we normally hear it. But do you see a similar change occurring there in these other cultures that happen that's some guess happened in the Norse culture about the Skyfaller being replaced as the chief deity by another deity?
That's a good question. I don't believe we do. And Dyeus or Dyeus is again cognate with Dyeus, and so you could argue is the chief god. But again, the patter's been left off, the father part. So is it just we just call the main god in effect? Is God the default name, or this shining or sky the default name for the deity, for the chief deity in Indo-European cultures? And so if that is the case, you can't tell who that god is and what their function are, because you don't know what Dyeus is actually referring to. It's just like a title. And a really good example of that is Freya in Scandinavian, who is could be classed as a fertility type god, where actually in Germanic we see him as Ingvi Freya, and Ingvi is means Lord. Although Freya means Lord, so it's Lord Ingvi. So in effect, people are simplifying God's names just to have the titles there. So we are starting to lose that. So it's really difficult to understand what the function of the gods are, and there's certainly no attestation to suggest that there's certainly no older documents to suggest how things have changed, and that's partly because of the late Christianization of these regions. So, for all the pros and cons you think Christianity may bring to the world, they were good at documenting things to a degree, although slightly biased. But because they came to the Baltic states quite late, we see that the things they document are post-Christian conversion. And so we see all sorts of weird stories that involve Christian gods and Christian figures rather than what we consider to be the more pagan type roles. And there's no clearer example than that than in Transylvania. They have a creation myth which has an earth diver myth. And the earth diver myth is probably one of the oldest creation myths we know, the type of myth anyway. And it involves a primordial ocean at the start of time. And on there's normally a duck or water bird. And that dives to the bottom of this primordial ocean, gets some mud and brings it up. And when the mud hits the surface of the water, it turns into a small island and it grows, and then a tree grows on the island and people come from the tree and life starts, and hurrah. And so we have examples of that story which we believe could be 30, 40,000 years old, and some people even believe it could be over 100,000 years old. So I have this story, but if you go to Transylvania, they have a story where God and the devil are basically in this primordial world, and God is telling the devil to, I think they're on a floating bed, and God tells the devil to go down and get mud and bring it up. So in effect, the Christians have taken these old pagan, what they would consider pagan, or certainly pre-Christian, pre-Judaism stories, and altered them to be Abrahamic in nature by putting the Abrahamic characters in there of God and the devil. So losing all track of who was originally there. But then the only way we can presume it was an earth dive myth is because every part of the story matches. The devil dives down, brings up mud, and land starts to form. But now the devil rolls God out of the bed, hoping to drown him, but God lands on the mud and then rolls the mud out into an island, and life then starts. So it's very interesting seeing these myths develop. But unfortunately, in much of the eastern part of Europe, we just have very little idea of what was going on before Christianity turned up and documented things, because there was just no written sources about anything going on at all. And it's a real shame on human history that we lack this. And it's a big problem we have in studying myths and going back and trying to find myths' origins, not just in Eastern Europe. We have this problem across much of Asia, across Africa, Australia, and the Americas. We just have a lack of documentation to tell us what happened before we started colonizing these places. Yes, a real shame. So we can't know for sure, but it is complicated again.
Very much indeed. And at some point, when we have another conversation on the subject, I do want to have a deeper dive on those other cultures and the connection between the old and new world, and because the way people think about it is, they typically think there can't be really a connection, and if there is one, it has to be super ancient. Now, it is true; it would have to be super ancient because of the crossing for the Bering Strait, which was a long time ago. But that doesn't mean there could not have been a common origin. But we'll dive into that in another time.
Absolutely.
But coming back to the Sky Father, I want to ask you about the Celtic god, the Dagda, because he's referred to as a Dago Diwos. and there have been links there that have been made by linguists to this to Dyeus, the Sky Father. But in my second part of that question is there's also another goddess. Dagda's a god. What I'm saying is there's a goddess called Danu,
Mm-hmm.
and there's also a Hindu goddess called Danu.
Of the river.
What do you make of all
that? I'll make of that. Some of it's coincidence, Jacob, and some of it is a almost like Celtic interpretatio or interpretatio. Yeah, interpretatio Celtico. Can you say that, Celtica? Possibly that in the Dagda, calling it Dagda. Well, Dyeus. In effect, you're suggesting that Dagda has the supreme god or chief god functions of the Indo-Europeans, which sort of makes sense. One of the problems we have with saying Celtic gods is that no one really knows what Celtic means. It's a word we say and we think we know what it means, but we're not entirely sure. I mean, because part of it's, you could argue, started in Germany, but much of it we often refer to into the Gaulish lands of France. But actually, if you look at it today, most people think of Ireland. So calling it Celtic is probably incorrect, because that's too broad a term. But certainly the Irish culture, probably 3,000, just over 3,000 years ago, probably had a more agrarian pantheon and an agrarian influence, which may be where we see this old cycle, the cycle of Ireland and the whole myth structure there with Danu and the Tooth of Dedan, and there's a whole story there about what's going on. And that seems to be a different cultural story to compare to the Indo-Europeans. And you could argue that could be agrarian, but you could also argue that Ireland, including the name, it's an island, it is cut off, and there's a higher chance of having a more localized, influenced culture. So it can develop its own myths and stories, and they're more likely to be retained. So there's a chance that this Irish cycle is very old indeed, but it'll be somewhere between the hunter-gatherer period and probably let me say probably between the agrarian migrations into Ireland and the Indo-European migrations into Ireland. So there's probably a few thousand-year period there. So I don't know when the farming culture got to Ireland. I'm going to guess around 3,500 BC, which is when we're starting to see the Yamnaya culture expanding out of the steppe region. So there was probably another 1,000 years or so before the Indo-Europeans started to get to Ireland. So plenty of time for myths to start. And you can argue, if two different cultures meet, one doesn't have to take over the other one for cultural exchange to happen. Although if one did take over the other, there would be definitely cultural exchange. But you'll probably see that where you see this sort of merge name, twin name of having two chief gods joined together. We see this in Roman culture. We see it in Greek culture. I mean, Zeus was associated with many other gods as the name of Zeus, and then another god's name. So I think that's just a part of that where they're trying to show that Dagda had a lot of influence on the pantheon and probably was the head of the pantheon. That is the whole culture around that and the stories. They're certainly, I would say, Indo-European because of things, all the stories associated with loss of the arm and like we see. So, that's. I'm sort of wandering around because there isn't much data, but Dagda, I think Indo-European influenced. Danu maybe from the agricultural farming myths, and that would make sense to me. But again, we there's just a lack of documentation to
Right.
make us sure about any of this. It is, when we get too specifics, it is a bit more woolly. Where we get stories, at least we've got a lot of data we can pull out of all these myth themes and compare them and say this story is like that story. But when it comes to individual gods, which aren't really attested to very well, it becomes so much harder to give us any sign of confidence or form of confidence on what we're saying.
In a way, it kind of gets worse, and we talked about this a bit last time, but I want to dive deeper even more. And that is, I like to call it the storm god paradox,
Okay.
because I see a confusion there among scholars when they try to deal with this problem. And that is, on the one hand, we have strong linguistic evidence of a link between Dyeus and Zeus. But on the other hand, scholars note strong parallels between Zeus and Indra, the supreme god of the Rig Veda. And Indra, in some cases, is Dyeus' son. So it kind of, that's my point. It kind of creates the paradox. So okay. So is the Sky Father being given the attributes of a storm god, or is it the reverse? What is happening there?
Great question. And it depends on the culture we're talking about. So, without doubt, so agrarian pantheons, so pantheons from the Near East, which influenced the northern Mediterranean coastline, so Greece, they tend to have a storm god, male chief deity, and a sky goddess. And that tends to be the general structure. Deal with a broad brush.
Oh, you muted yourself. John, you muted yourself on StreamYard. Hold on, guys. I'm trying to get his attention. You're muted, John. I don't know how this happened. You are muted. Trying to get his attention, everybody. Hold on. John, I wonder if he muted his own. I wonder if he muted his own sound completely by accident. I'm trying to tell him. I try to tell him several times, and he's not. He's gonna have to repeat everything he's saying again. John. Okay, so I alerted him that he's muted right now, so he's trying to fix it. Yeah, I muted myself because I was calling him real quick. I had no other choice. So I think he's working on getting reconnected into StreamYard. I think I'll trim that blunder out of the stream when it's over. Okay, John, can you hear me?
I can't hear you, Jacob. So that is very odd. Can you
Let's
hear
give
me?
him a second. Yeah, I hear you.
You can hear me.
Yes.
I can't hear you. So that's, but if you can hear me, I can witter on a bit. Why can't I hear you? Let me just quickly check that. Hope you don't mind. Headphones, Rodecaster, yeah. But I don't understand why I can't hear you, but okay. Would you like me to start talking again about Storm God's Dyeus? Why can't I hear you?
I'm trying to tell him to check his StreamYard settings to make sure that's set to appropriate speakers.
Audio, desktop microphone mode, headphone mode.
I know he can't hear me. I'm texting him. Sorry about this, everybody. I'm trying to alert him that he just muted himself on StreamYard.
Right. I still can't hear you though, so I'm really baffled. What's gone on? It's very strange why that was suddenly. I'm getting no noise out my speaker. I don't know what's happened. I'm sorry about this, Jacob. This is very odd. I could reboot my machine. Nothing's turned all the way down. Everything's fine. I haven't touched anything. So I was literally just talking, and if I stopped. Okay, I'll be back.
All right, everybody, let's give him a second to reboot his machine because obviously there's something wrong. And if he can't hear me, but I can hear him, it would not make sense to continue the stream. So let's give this one last chance to make it work right now, or we'll just have to continue this discussion later, at a later time. But in the meantime, my personal take on the storm god paradox, as I like to call it, and it's something that I have researched for many years. And so I do know quite a lot about it, like he does. But my take is it seems like to me the storm god was probably given the title of his father. And that to me might best explain the situation, because in the Rig Veda, which I do have it, it's a very interesting text. Indra is clearly Dyeus' son, and one of the top scholars of Hinduism, who also knows a lot about the Proto-Indo-European religion, Wendy Doniger, and I've had her on the channel a few times. She thinks Indra, Zeus, and Odin are exactly the same god with different names, and I do agree with that assessment. I've pretty much agreed with that assessment since like 2013. About the same time that I concluded that the Ishkur is the god of the Bible. The latest video I did on that subject, I did it with Derek. So it was streamed to both this channel and Derek's channel. About how Baal became Yahweh, and what I mean by that is really Baal Hadad. There are several Baals of canon, and it's kind of funny because it sounds like something else. But anyway, but the biblical Baal that the Bible speaks against was a different god, and some people in the comments did not understand that distinction properly. But Baal Haman and Baal Hadad are definitely not the same god. Okay, so John is back.
Right.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you. I have no idea what went on, but my audio system.
Well, all that matters is that it's fixed.
Well,
somehow it's fixed.
Well, I haven't fixed the problem. I've really stopped the symptoms.
Hopefully it doesn't come up again. It was all of a sudden where I couldn't hear anything you were saying, and I tried to tell you that you were muted several times. You couldn't hear me. But
yes,
glad my suggestion worked.
Reboot solves everything. Right.
You'll have to start completely over on your answer.
On the Storm God and Dyeus, and who's who. Why Storm God
Dyeus? You were muted pretty much the whole time.
Okay, I apologize then to everyone.
No problem. It happens.
Some people have enjoyed me being muted, but I'm back. So, why are some storm gods the chief god, the Dyeus, and why do some deities have storm god attributes? And there's no storm god. So, the answer is complicated and it depends on the culture. So, the Greek pantheon, let's start with the Greek pantheon. That's a really good example of that, where we see that Heracles has all the mythology of a storm god, but has no godlike powers. Okay, so who has the godlike powers of the storm god? Zeus. So we see an example here where Zeus has come along, or Dyeus has come along in name, gone into the pantheon, and perhaps the god Dyeus replaced, because Hera must have been married to someone, because you have this pairing in pantheons, was a storm god. So Zeus got there, taken on that role, and we do see some epithets which align to or analog to Zeus Percinus, meaning Zeus thunder god. So he's taken on this potentially, but then Heracles, who doesn't have godlike powers, loses the thunder ability. And then what's even more weird is that Heracles is named after Hera, Zeus's wife, but Zeus and his wife Hera couldn't have given birth and copulated to make Heracles, because if they had, Heracles would be a god. So Hera isn't Heracles' wife, even though Heracles means glory to Hera. So that's all very odd and strange why that is. But then if you go to the Vedic pantheon, we find that Dyeus is in there, much like Greek, but there is Indra, who is a storm god, who seems to take much of the front page news, the headlines, does all the good stuff. So what's going on? Well, actually, it all comes down to what Dyeus actually means, which I sort of hinted at all the way through this sort of discussion, which is that Dyeus has dropped a putter. And so what does Dyeus really mean? And if we look at Roman society, we see that the Jupiter, everybody worships Jupiter once a year. You have to do your offerings to Jupiter and everybody will be happy. But literally, once you've done one offering to Jupiter, you find that then people make 100 offerings to Mars, to make the crops grow and things to happen. And this is what's happening, that the role of the chief god, the supreme god, is actually quite insignificant in the day-to-day sort of outcomes of society. And so, yes, they worshipped and acknowledged them, but the people are more aligned to specific gods that will fulfill their daily needs, which isn't the supreme god. So I think that's why some gods change their function, change their ability. And I think when it comes to the need for a storm god to either give rain for crops or to, in effect, give some strength, some warrior-like strength, because that's where you tend to find these gods offering this kind of functionality after you sacrifice to them. That those societies that needed that probably put the storm function high up, for their needs. So certainly Vedic did that because of Indra. In Greek, it wasn't quite like that because Heracles, I say, was not a god, but he did have the mythology. So it sounds like when the Greek created that pantheon, they were not so in need of rain and war, where the Vedic people were. I don't know how true that's going to be, but that is my gut feel based on how we see the pantheons today and why they are where they are. And if we look at the Scandinavian pantheon, just to add the extra dimension to this discussion, say there is no Dyeus, there was a Tyr, and the storm god actually is called Thor, which probably means thunder, and his Mjolnir, the hammer, means lightning, but actually he isn't really much of a storm god. You very rarely see him go into the clouds and create thunder and lightning and rains for that, but it was a warrior type function. So we see that Odin hasn't got that power, that is the chief god, and there is a storm god there that does have that power, because much of society was fighting, was raiding, and so they needed that kind of god to help them, where Odin is literally associated with royalty almost exclusively. So he wasn't really a god of the people. So that's the way to look at these pantheons, is that Dyeus is a title of a supreme god, but the supreme god doesn't look after your day-to-day needs. You need other gods to do that.
Some see a similarity between the way that Odin and his brothers Billy V are ganging up together against Ymir, and they tear him apart.
Mm-hmm.
with Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades coming together in alliance against Kronos to overthrow him. Do you see, it may not be perfectly the same, of course, but do you see some similarities that could indicate either an influence or a common influence that's going on in those stories?
No. Okay, and I'll explain why. Because the story of this patricide, matricide, incest, sons killing fathers, daughters sleeping with fathers, and sons sleeping with mothers, and all this sort of stuff going on in the cosmogony of the Greek pantheon is something we see in the cosmogonies of agrarian culture, where the sacrifice of Ymir to create the world is something we see in Indo-European culture. They're different cultures. That's not to say there aren't some similarities and probably some influence, but I would say they are not similar at the theme level at all in terms of narratives. They are influenced from different origins.
Does the story of of Odin, Vili, and V tearing apart Ymir kind of remind you of what happens with when Marduk and Tiamat battle. Marduk defeats Tiamat, and she's torn apart to make the world and humanity.
That's the important bit. It is to that there'll always be similarity if you kill someone and tear them apart. You can't, killing someone and tearing them apart will look the same. It's the then creating the world, that aspect of the story. That's the, as we say, we split narratives into mythemes so we can compare narratives to see if they are similar. And gods killing monsters, lots of stories have that. You can, so whatever, gods ripping the monster apart, lots of stories have that. But gods then making a world out of a story, that's a creation myth. So that would suggest there is some similarity there. The difference, though, is that in the Near Eastern myths, we see that it's a two-part creation. So in fact, it's a firmament. You split the monster into two. In Indo-European, we have the homologies of, we see a macrocosm and a microcosm type aspect to a huge body creating the cosmos, and then the cosmos creating the body. Is a different different cosmogony completely.
So do you see, when you look at the Babylonian story of Marduk that we just talked about, and the story of Odin and his brothers tearing apart Ymir and creating everything from Ymir's body is a corpse, do you think it was a common origin, or is it possible that migrants from Babylon or the Near East influenced Europeans and gave them that idea?
No, I think it is because agrarian culture was first. We may well see pantheons and beliefs settle across Indo-European landscape, and particularly Europe, and then the Indo-Europeans come along and have different strengths of influence across those cultures, and apply their beliefs on top, in effect. But if that is the case, then when we look at, for example, Enoch, that has the homologies in, and the Dove King in Abrahamic religion, we see at the Temple of Europa, the Judaism temple, it has Zoroastrianism type imagery in it. We see the cattle raiding myth, which is a very Indo-European influenced myth about cattle being stolen by a dragon, and then a warrior going out to defeat the dragon to get the cattle back. In David and the Philistines, and actually through into Africa, we see that even the Sand people have that story. To me, it is more likely, although I get a significant amount of pushback by even suggesting it, that it is more likely that they have taken an Indo-European influence to the myth than the other way around. And one of the things that's quite interesting that is in the Enuma Elish, the discovery of a new tablet, tablet 5 or whatever, I think that was in the 1960s, which talked about Tiamat being a cow. And that, you could argue, maybe suggest some Indo-European influence who were very bovine focused initially, before the horse came along. So, because he talks about Tiamat having udders and there's some other aspects of what this serpent or what monster or primordial being looks like. So if one culture influenced the other out of agrarian and Indo-European in terms of the cosmogony, in the last 5,000, 6,000 years, I would say Indo-Europeans were more likely to influence the Near Eastern cosmogony than the other way around. But that's not to say they didn't have an earlier route that was the same, which started in the Near East before going into the Caucasus and the steppe. But we can't tell that. There isn't enough evidence for us to make a decision either on how that really started, or no one's done research that I'm aware of that helps us to have confidence in that.
So I'm going to take a super chat question that's been sitting there for a while. Solar
Okay.
Knight, pick up your super chat. Is Dyeus the Sky Father of which evolved Sol Invictus of the Romano-Gothic era, which evolved the Sun Cross Christ of Constantine era, all manifestations of the same deity?
I believe Sol Invictus is far more likely to be influenced from Near Eastern culture because of the need for farming and the need for the sun to grow crops. I believe whilst we have a sun deity within many Indo-European pantheons, I don't see the influence being equal to Sol Invictus in Rome, and therefore that would make me feel like it is more of an agrarian thing. Again, we probably haven't got enough data to be sure of it either way. We have to be honest here. We do, some of this is guesswork, and it's all probabilities. But probably I would say it's more likely to come from the Near East than from the Indo-Europeans.
And how does one arrive at the conclusion of which direction of dependence is more likely? How does that methodology work? Like I'm
Okay.
familiar with it, but for the audience that
Okay,
doesn't
so
know about that.
when we compare narratives, so stories, we use something called phylogenetics or computational comparative mythology. It's more of a layman's term. So we can compare myths, and using some math, we can work out what are statistically similar and what are different, and what are more likely to have, which myths are likely to have evolved one way or the other, because some things can and can't happen in myth. For example, in a myth, if you have a animal that does something special, and then we see a myth where a person does something special and everything else is the same, there's a chance that, providing the cultures are close to each other, that the myth of the animal doing something have evolved into the human doing something, because we see narratives, animals transform into humans as time goes on. But we rarely, if ever, see a myth where a human does something and then that's changed into an animal in a later myth. So we can see patterns that allow us to try and understand which way myths evolved. We break myths down into mythemes, which are small, concise parts of a story that are less liable to corruption if they pass linguistic or cultural borders. So that means that if a myth, let's say, travels from the Anatolian to let's say the Ugaritic people, they would go through probably a language barrier. And if you had looked at the stories as their narratives from a high level, they would look completely different. But if we break them down into mythemes and then look at how, if those mythemes exist in the stories, they'd probably be the same. So this is a really good method of using mythemes. So we break the story down into that and compare those. And then we look at other aspects, such as, do we know any migration patterns and when they happened? Do we know how language developed? And using all this information together, along with archaeological information, which may help us indicate that certain cultures went one way or the other, we can then look at these stories and work out a probability of which way a story, compared to stories, a story could have influenced. And over a large region, we can look at multiple stories, and we can say, looking at all this, we put them sort of in a large matrix, compare all to all, what is the likely transmission path of a story, and do that. And then if you do, then say, look at the migration data and then the other data, that gives us sort of further confidence that, what is the most likely route of a story's evolution and dispersal path. And so we call that phylogenetics, in effect, in a nutshell. But that's how we do it. It's a lot of math, and it's usually a lot of manual work. But there's something else I do. So I curate a database called the Mythology Database, and that has hundreds of thousands of narratives on there, many stories, and they have already been broken down into their myth themes. So we've done all the hard, well, I've done all the hard work, computational wise. So people can now take those and do comparative mythology really simply and compare narratives with similar myth themes, and we can get pretty much instant results at a high level without the dispersal information, linguistic evolution information, but it allows us to really quickly understand if myths could be related. So it's a whole sort of subject in its own right in terms of computational comparative pathology. It's still finding support, although support is growing for it, because there's a natural bias for people not to believe that stories can persist, and certainly not persist for tens of thousands of years, as we can suggest with this data. So that's the process around it. Breaking a story down into small parts that we can compare with confidence, and then from that we can build up a confidence map on whether certain stories then could evolve into other stories, and then use other data external around dispersals and archaeology to provide confidence in to support or not support the findings of the narrative evolution path.
What do you make of the sun god element in the Sky Father? Because some see connections with perhaps a solar aspect of the deity, or him being interpreted as a light deity, a bringer of light of sorts.
Yeah, it's a
What do you make
shining.
of that?
Yeah, so yeah, Dyeus, as I say, Dyeus, while we consider it to be sky or God, actually literally means shining. But to me, I look at that as being daylight rather than the sun, because there was a deity for the sun and a deity for the moon and a deity for the night. We can have pretty good confidence of that. So I don't think there is a strong relationship between the Sky Father or Deus Pater and the sun deity. And in fact, we can't even be clear on whether the sun and moon deities were part of the family tree of Deus. And even more importantly, we have to think about, if we look at the cosmogony, that the killing of Ymir allowed the earth to be made. Sometimes his eyes are made as the sun and the moon, like in Nemo's the sun and the moon. Therefore, the sun can't be a deity in the same sort of way. So there's actually a conflict of mythology going on here with what the sun is. So it may be that the cosmogony of this cosmic cycle of having a body to create the earth and people, and then people dying to go back into the cosmos, reduced the actual significance of the solar deity, the sun deity. It's certainly in the pastoral farming cultures of the Indo-Europeans, where maybe that aspect of a pantheon is more likely to persist in the northern Mediterranean cultures and the agricultural farming cultures, because they are more focused on growing crops rather than breeding animals. So that would be my view, that there is no significant relationship, one because of cosmogony and two because of the cultural need.
What are other situations or within the studies of this particular deity, Dyeus, that would you say could also further complicate or are already complicating the matter when trying to really break down succinctly this deity and trying to untangle him from the conflations, the reimaginations across these various myths?
Even more complicated. Stuff, we don't have attestation of these stories, how they developed. We know we have constructed the Proto-Indo-European pantheon based on information we have written down no later than 3,500 years ago. So there's already been 2, 3, potentially even 4,000 years of religious evolution that is a blank to us. All we've got is the result, and the result is that Dyeus has become Dyeus, has become just a name of a god, like a title, who goes to Zeus and Jupiter and Tiwaz and the like, and there's in the Rig Veda. So it's a blank. There is we are missing something, and we will never find it. It's that it's just not there. So we don't know. It's as simple as that. There is no added complication. We just don't know. Why did Dyeus become Dyeus? That's I don't. Yeah, it's hard to tell. No one knows. Sorry for not being able to answer that, but I can't even guess what that change was.
And in my final question, when you look at the Proto-Indo-European religion, the reconstruction of it as a whole, do you see parts of the argument where you would perhaps disagree with the way it's reconstructed in any way? Like, somebody might come, let's just say somebody might come out and say, this part of it just seems too hypothetical, doesn't really fit the data.
I've just spent 2 hours before this meeting talking to someone exactly about that. So, yes, it is hypothetical. I'm using probability, and the trouble is, if you probabilistically assume something and you build on top of that, that thing is already probabilistically restricted in scope. And if you build on that, that's restricted. So all of a sudden, you may be confident about Dyeus, but as you go up building on him, you can be even less confident about the things later on, and that is a problem. But the other way I also look at it is that we do have lots of data to support that, such as the names you started off with, saying about Manu and Yemo. They appear in all those stories, and stories may be archetypical, may be part of human nature, but to have the same names as well, exceptionally unlikely. So it does come down to probabilities and likelihoods, and this isn't a black and white subject. This is folklore. This is there is no absolutes. We don't know why some stories were told the way they are. Even today, stories are made up. Why did someone write the Book of Mormon, or why did someone think aliens came, or alive at Roswell? People make up stories, and we just don't know why they cling to the human imagination and persist. So it's tough, and I get, I'm aware there's a lot of bias against the work I do. A lot of people don't consider it of importance. I've just finished a course at Oxford last year on folklore, and my lecturer was less than enamored with my approach at finding the origins of myth. But I've wrote papers saying this is how it works, and they all passed. So there's just I think there's a natural human bias amongst some people, as some people believe in God, some people don't believe that we can persist myths and take them back. But I believe we can. I believe we have good data. We have some incredibly clever people to have done some great work. And with the mythology database I've created, I say we've literally can change the way how folklore is studied. Now we've made huge impacts. Things are so much quicker, so much easier, and at the tip of your fingertips to use. So yeah, I can't be 100% on anything, and if you need something to be 100%, you're never going to be happy. So I'd rather spend time talking to people who are happy with probabilities, because what's the probability of God existing? And I'll say it's less likely than the likelihood of what I talk about being accurate.
Shalar and I thank you for another super chat. Will Dyeus get resurrected in the future, finding new worshippers?
Who knows? Some people need religion. Who knows? It's there is there's talk of resurgence in paganism, but there are some weird branches of paganism. Some of it's really good, really thought out. Some of it's being done for the wrong reasons. So some people would argue Zeus has always been here, just in different forms. And in fact, Yahweh may be a form of Zeus. He's a god. So I'd like to talk to you about that one day. I'm sure we'll have a really good chat about the origins of God.
Oh, yeah. And just remind everybody real quick that John's YouTube channel, Craig and Ford, is tagged in the description below, and it will also be in the pinned comment. That being said, John, thank you for joining me once again.
Jacob, always a pleasure. Sorry about the technical difficulties. Take care.
All good, man. Thanks again.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.